Keel stood there in shock, tomahawk in hand, witnessing the apparent brutal demise of his older brother. There, only 10 feet in front of him, his brother, Ahanu, lay on the ground with a hulking grizzly bear standing over him, with the young man's head in its mouth. The man's face was pinned down into the dirt on its side, facing toward his terrified younger brother. The bear squeezed its jaws, and the man's eye began popping out of its socket as the skull formation around it began to slightly crack. He moaned, and he begged his younger brother to kill him. His arm was already nearly ripped off, dangling only on a few strings of flesh. He gazed into his brother's eyes, with the one good eye he had left. "Hurl it at me! Release my spirit!" he begged of him. His brother stand there, still frozen in fear. "What's up, guys? Iceman here." So what you have before you now is one of the most horrendous grizzly bear attacks that I've ever heard of. This is a part of the Chronicles of Clubfoot series. A giant grizzly bear that weighed 1,600 pounds that roamed North America a few centuries ago. But I warn you, this story is brutal. But first off, I'd like to thank you guys for all your support on this channel. And if you will, paw that like button, subscribe to the page, and hit the bell so you're notified next time I post a video. And if you want to support me further, you can become a channel member or a patron. Links in the description below. So let's get into this chilling tale. The bear groaned with the skull still sucked into its mouth as its spit oozed down the man's face. He begged again for death. He knew his brother was a good marksman with a tomahawk. He trained him after all. And at that point, Keel aimed for the center of his brother's forehead, breathing heavily and shaking with fear as he leaned back to make the throw. Death, in their tribe, wasn't feared, but viewed as a great natural part of life. It was understood as a spiritual journey, a necessary step forward in order that the spirit may walk on. Keel himself believed that the entire universe is alive, including rocks and rivers. He viewed death as a journey and continuation of life on Earth. There was a widespread belief that the deceased would reincarnate into another animal or person based on their deeds in this life. And Keel knew that until this moment, he lived a good life. The tomahawk hissed through the air and struck Keel's shoulder. The young man screamed in agony from the piercing pain. The bear took notice to the added threat on the scene, but only clamped down harder on its victim. It shuffled itself down, belly to the ground, still clinging tightly to the man's skull, as he begged for mercy and a swift death. His skull began to crack some more, with a puddle of blood forming on the ground beneath him. The western U.S. was largely unknown to European settlers until after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1776. At the turn of the 19th century, the Louisiana Purchase was signed, and the now famous Lewis and Clark expedition was commissioned to explore the land west of the Mississippi River. Prior to settlement, there was limited contact between most Native American tribes and European explorers, most of which centered around trade. At the time, there was an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 individual grizzly bears inhabiting the western and central U.S. Native American groups considered the bears with respect, as capable opponents and sometimes as a source of food. Some tribes in California, and probably elsewhere, featured grizzly bear as a main character in their origin stories. A bear claw necklace was a desirable possession that was thought to confer protection and good health to the wearer. From the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition, we learn that the Mandan Indians warned the Europeans of grizzly bears, telling about the mysterious monster. The Indians told them how they hunted the grizzly in parties of 8 or 10 men, and that the warriors wore paint, as they would when going to war against their enemies. The Mandan Indians inhabited what is now central North Dakota. Later on in their travels, Lewis and Clark eventually met with the beast the Native Americans had warned them about. They wrote that the bears were difficult to kill even with a rifle, especially with the time it would take to reload. A bear would continue to charge at its pursuer, enraged and able to take many shots before falling. As the bear continued to destroy and maul Ahanu's body, Keel was faced with an ultimatum. His brother could barely scream at this point, with the bear ripping apart his upper rib cage, his eyeball completely hanging out of its socket as it continued to rake its claws against his hopeless body. This endeavor, after all, was the product of a game of pride and honor. The young men of the day would play games with the grizzly bears, seeing how close they could get to them before being potentially mauled. This is exactly the position that Keel and his brother found themselves in before Ahanu got just a bit too close. Keel ran at the bear with a great warrior shout and jumped on its back as it lay over his brother's seemingly lifeless carcass. He began attempting to rip clusps of fur out of its hide, but the creature didn't take any notice of him as it raked and chewed on his brother's carcass. Keel noticed his bloodied tomahawk only a few feet away from his brother's skull, so he got off the bear and grabbed the tool, lifted his arm high, and heaved with all of his might the tool into the bear's shoulder. The moment it hit the grizzly, it turned around and lunged at Keel, taking him to the ground and mauling him for only a few seconds before returning to his lifeless brother. It cracked with its jaws some of Keel's shoulder and forearm before letting the young man go. And moments later, as Keel would witness the disgusting sounds of grinds and slurps and cracks from his brother's body, he staggered back to his feet. He watched in horror as the bear began eating his brother alive. And at that point he knew he was to return home to his tribe. In shame, he began backing away from the hideous scene, the bear only looking back at him on occasion, only to return eating his brother. Keel knew that Ahanu was dead, and that at this point he had to only save his own life, so he continued to back away from the hideous scene. And then, without a second thought, he turned and ran. The bear never seemed to follow him or chase him, and from that point on, he aimed to get revenge on this giant grizzly bear. The legend of this creature spread throughout his tribe, and even some of the European settlers heard of its tale and had encounters with it themselves. But nonetheless, I would love to share with you more stories and legends behind this giant bear, so stay tuned to this channel for those. And let me know in the comments, have you heard of old clubfoot and situations that perhaps the Native Americans had with this bear as well? What's your viewpoint on this incident that happened between Keel, his brother Ahanu, and this 1,600-pound grizzly bear? It seems like the boys knew that they were getting into trouble with it, and it was a risk they were willing to take. But unfortunately, things just really went haywire somewhere, and I can only hope that the death was relatively painless for the young man. But let me know your thoughts on these matters in the comments below. Like this video if you will, subscribe to this page, and I'll see you soon with more chilling tales from the Iceman.